Once you learn to read, you will be free forever. Frederick Douglass. When Frederick Douglass was still enslaved, he caught the attention of his master's wife. She was not yet hardened by the institution of slavery, and upon noticing his intelligence and curiosity, she began teaching him to read. At first, it was innocent. Reading the Bible, simple words, but it did not stay innocent for long. When her husband discovered what she was doing, he was livid. He declared in no uncertain terms that teaching a slave to read was dangerous, that literacy would ruin him. And in that moment, Douglass realized something profound. If someone was willing to fight so hard to keep him from reading, then reading must be the very thing that could set him free. And so despite the punishment, despite the secrecy, despite the risks, Douglass taught himself to read. He traded food for lessons, practiced in the shadows, and devoured whatever scraps of literature he could find. That skill became his sword. That knowledge became his fire. And through it, he became one of the most powerful voices for freedom in American history. He wrote Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, a work that shook the conscience of a nation. He penned speeches, essays, and articles that awakened a sleeping world to the horrors of slavery and the brilliance of Black intellect. Frederick Douglass understood that voice is power, that speaking truth, even in the face of punishment, is how change begins. And that is why I must speak, and why I am asking you to do the same. There comes a time when silence is no longer noble, when staying quiet is no longer about humility, but about fear. And I reached that point during the darkest chapter of my life, my prosecution and incarceration. It became personal, painfully personal. And I realized that if I didn't speak up and speak out, the truth would be buried beneath a mountain of public misunderstanding. So let's get to the point. Yes, $500,000 is a lot of money. I don't deny that. But what the public never saw, what the headlines never told, was the heart behind every dollar. That money didn't go toward luxury or excess. It went towards sheltering women who had nowhere else to go, feeding children who were slipping through the cracks, and providing life-saving support in ways traditional funding sources refused to touch. The media spun a narrative that fit a familiar and comfortable storyline. A person misuses government funds for personal gain. But that wasn't me. I didn't enrich my own pockets. I enriched lives. I stood in the gap when no one else would. And I did it because I couldn't bear to see people suffer while red tape choked the system. Still, that narrative became the armor that justified my conviction. It felt like a betrayal, not just of me, but of the women and children I served, to reduce their stories, their breakthroughs, and their survival to a footnote in my prosecution was not just unfair, it was devastating. And that's why I had to speak up, because if I didn't, who would? When I found discrepancies in paperwork, flaws that would prevent resources from reaching the vulnerable, I made a choice. It wasn't a perfect choice, and I'm not here to excuse it, but it was made from a place of advocacy, not greed. There's a vast difference between lying to the government to fatten your wallet and doing so because you realize that the system is leaving people behind. That distinction matters. It matters for every advocate who puts their heart on the line to serve. It matters for every change maker who faces impossible decisions within broken systems. It matters for society. Because if we blur those lines, we discourage compassion, innovation, and justice. Speaking out wasn't easy. In fact, it was terrifying. There were days I questioned whether it was worth it. But I knew that if I wanted peace of mind, if I wanted healing, I had to reclaim my story. Not to shift blame, but to offer context. To paint a fuller picture, to give notice to the people who benefited from the funding decisions I made. My incarceration tried to strip me of my voice, but it only made me more determined to use it. I've spent hours writing, praying, crying, and reflecting. I thought about the women who slept safely in transitional housing I helped fund. I remember the children who finally had a meal because I said yes when the system said no. And I thought about the future, about what kind of world we were building when we punish people not for their intention, but for not fitting neatly into bureaucratic boxes. I thought about the fear that instills in other visionaries who might one day hesitate to act boldly for fear of prosecution. So, I chose to speak up for the truth, to speak out for justice, to draw the line between exploitation and advocacy, to name the pain and the purpose. Because when you don't tell your story, someone else will tell it for you. And they won't always tell it right. I was not perfect. I was human. But I was also powerful. And in my imperfection, I acted with love, with courage, with a fierce commitment to those who society too often forgets. The world needs more truth tellers, not just the ones with spotless records, but those who have walked through the fire and come out with wisdom. We need more people who are willing to speak out even when their voices shake, even when it costs them everything. To do that, you must confront the belief that your voice doesn't matter. You must push past the fear of judgment, the weight of shame, and the risk of being misunderstood. It's not easy. You will question yourself. You will feel vulnerable. But on the other side of fear is freedom. Not just for you, but for others who need your truth. You must overcome the limitation of perfectionism. The idea that you must have the perfect words, the perfect moment, or a perfect story to tell. You don't. What you need is honesty, conviction, and the willingness to be real. The world doesn't need polished performances. It needs people who are brave enough to speak their truth with trembling hands and hopeful hearts. You'll need to silence the internal voice that tells you your past disqualifies you. It doesn't. In fact, your past may be your greatest qualification. It's proof that you've lived, that you've struggled, and that you found something worth saying. Speak from your scars, not from your shame. Your voice will reach further when it comes from a place of lived experience. So where does the strength come from? It comes from your purpose, from knowing that your story can create healing, that your words can inspire action, that your courage can unlock someone else's cage. The strength to speak up is born in the quiet decision to no longer be silent. It comes from connection, from knowing you're not alone. Others have walked this path, and others will walk after you. You're part of a greater chain of truth tellers, of freedom fighters, of survivors who turn their pain into purpose. Draw strength from their stories, just as I drew strength from Frederick Douglass and countless others who dared to speak when silence was safe. We cannot be afraid to confront false narratives, especially when those narratives discourage people from using resources as tools for change. We must not let fear silence us. We must remember that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. What happened to me was not just about law. It was about perception. And perception has power. It shapes policies. It influences opinions. It fuels systems of punishment or pathways of redemption. That's why the way my story is told matters. I want others to know that you can fall and still be righteous. You can be evicted and still be compassionate. You can face judgment and still be justified in your intentions. Your mistakes don't erase your impact. I speak up not just for me, but for every advocate whose heart is bigger than the boxes they have to check. For every person who dares to care deeply in a world that demands distance. For every soul that risks everything to bring healing where there is hurt. My story is not just about a courtroom. It's about courage. It's about nuance. It's about the gray areas that rarely make headlines, but always shape lives. And I hope that by speaking out, I inspire others to tell the truth, even when it's complicated, even when it's hard. Because truth brings clarity, and clarity creates change. So if you have a story to tell it. If you see injustice, name it. If you are misunderstood, don't shrink, stand tall. Speak up and speak out. Because your voice might just be the light someone else needs to find their way through the dark. And if I can do it, so can you. You've got this. Peace and blessings, Dr. O.